This is History on Drugs, and today we're going to talk about the history of opium. Someone recently asked me, is opium like pot or weed, marijuana? And the answer is no. Opium is crazy and powerful and highly addictive, and it's one of the oldest substances found on Earth. And the craziest part about this specific opium poppy, which has some Latin name, but do you really care? It's the opium poppy, was domesticated by man, meaning there are hundreds of variables and breeds of poppy plants, but over time, in the Neolithic period, man actually genetically modified a species of the poppy plant, taking all the best attributes to develop the highly addictive, highly powerful opium poppy. So what is it? It's a plant. It's got a beautiful flower on it. Right now, it grows. Most of the world's supply of it comes from like Turkey and Afghanistan, and then down in South and Central America. But the plant itself has a green seed bag, and it's round and it's pretty big. And when that green seed bag is unripe, what they do, and they've been doing for thousands of years, is they scar the seed bag, just like this microphone, and this milky substance oozes out of it. They let that milky substance sit, and it turns into a brown, sticky coagulation of a product. And from there, they can turn it into whatever. There's three main alkaloids in that milky substance. The first one is morphine, which naturally occurs in the substance. And that's a very powerful alkaloid, and it's what they eventually synthesize to produce heroin. And it's got very strong sedative effects. There's also codeine, which isn't quite as strong, but can help like as a cough suppressant. And then there's thebaine, and it's the thebaine where they synthesize it, and they've been able to develop pills like Oxycontin, Vicodin, oxycodone, things like that. But now in the labs, they can actually just mimic the alkaloid properties and produce highly potent opioids like fentanyl. So for thousands of years, up until modern times, it's been used in a similar way by many cultures. They'll take the oozy substance, they'll let it dry overnight, and then they'll crush it down into a powder. They'll let the sticky part form into a pill or like gum, or they'll liquefy it and put it in a drink. And it wasn't until like the 1800s that we developed the hypodermic needle to actually shoot it into the veins to speed up the efficacy of the drug. So let's look at the history of the opium poppy. The first discovery of a poppy that had any type of small narcotic properties was about 10,000 years ago in the Jordan Valley. When researchers discovered this, they found it buried with a human. So that means it had some kind of meaning. And after they tested the seed of the poppy that was discovered there, they found it was the horn poppy, right? And so the horny poppy, that's a very horny poppy. The horn poppy doesn't have the same strength as what the opium poppy will eventually have, but it was buried with a human 10,000 years ago, so it must have had some significance. Now, somewhere between that discovery and about 7,000 years ago in the Neolithic era, researchers discovered the mother lode. They discovered the first use of what we know today as the opium poppy. So at that time, humans were nomadic, right? They didn't settle in one place. They moved around. It wasn't quite an agricultural society where they farmed, so we have to stay there till the crops come. We're going to build dwellings. You know, they were like cavemen-ish, right? They would live in caves or just travel and set up a temporary housing shelter. So somewhere outside Barcelona, the Neolithic people were mining in a mountain area there. And so near this mine, there was a burial. In one of the burials, the skeleton they found actually had a opium poppy seed stuck in its teeth. And then researchers analyzed the skeleton and found that the bone structure is that of a person who abused opiates. So this dude was an addict of some sort 7,000 years ago. And so now the first time on Earth, we see the opium poppy being used for some purpose by man for a long time because of the way it deteriorated the bones. Now, some scientists believe that, and researchers believe that the horn poppy is where they genetically modified it from. It was domesticated from that. Others believe it came from the dwarf poppy, which is wild and grows naturally in the Mediterranean area. So whether it's this one or that one, they were able to, through domestication, to create the very potent and powerful opium poppy. So we see this 7,000 years ago, and then it moves through Europe. So archaeologists have discovered in the Swiss Alps evidence of the cultivation of the opium poppy. So somebody was growing it there. It didn't come from there, so they brought it in. They've also discovered it in other areas in France and around Europe. And then it starts moving in through the Mediterranean area in Europe into Mesopotamia, into specifically Samaria, which is like in modern day Iraq. Now, when I was a kid, they taught us that Samaria is where man came from, right? It's the cradle of civilization, which is not really true. It's the place where man evolved cognitively because it's the oldest site that we've ever found writing from, or the resemblance of ideas and science and beliefs and arts and pottery, right? And in this civilization, now we're looking at about 5,000 plus years ago, there's evidence of the opium poppy use there. And they even had a name for it in some of their cuneiform writings, where many people believe they refer to it as hogil, which translates to joy plant. Now, whenever there's good research and we find something fascinating, another group of researchers comes along and says, bullshit, hogil means joy cucumber. Like, I don't think anybody's going to write joy cucumber. Maybe this is not the show for joy cucumber. But either way, there was also images depicting it, right? And other writings that discuss the medical use or spiritual use of the opium poppy, which how they were using it, we're not sure. There was some pottery found with seeds in it, right? Evidence of the seeds in it. So it's possible it was ceremonial. Now, we know that Mesopotamia and that region through the Nile Valley had a strong trade relation with ancient Egypt. And we did an episode on ancient Egypt, and we talked about some of the uses of the poppy in that society. So when we get to, we're still around 45 to 5,000 years ago, trade between the two civilizations exists because we're finding pottery and evidence in each place from the other. There's no early specific evidence of the use of the opium poppy at that point, but within 1,000 to 1,500 years, researchers discovered something called the Ebers Papyrus. And this was a scroll that basically had all these like medical procedures and ideas and treatments. And some of the treatments in there discuss the opium poppy. For instance, a crying baby, give it some opium, right? You give it a little powder. Don't give it too much. The baby might overdose. So that was one of the problems in these ancient civilizations, is there was no dose regulation or no way to know if this batch of opium we have is as strong or weaker than the next batch. So a lot of people that were experimenting with it or using it for religious or medical purposes or personal, we don't know if they knew the right dose to take, and a lot of people overdosed, right? There's also evidence of the opium poppy in that civilization through burials. We found the dried poppy flower, poppy plant earrings, opium poppy plant earrings, and more pottery and drawings of the poppy. So it flourished in ancient Egypt, and under King Tut in Thebes, it became some of the most powerful and popular opium in the world. Now, as we get down through like 1500 BC, it starts moving into other parts of the Mediterranean and just really flourishing in that area of Europe, Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. And a discovery of a little statue known as the Poppy Goddess was found in the Minoan civilization, and that was about 1500 BC. And this statue literally had 3 opium poppy plants coming out of its head. And on the poppy plants, it was actually scarred on the seed bulb. And then the eyes were like, in the face, so it looks high. So this could very well be the first evidence depicting use of the poppy to be high. And a similar discovery, not far from there, found an actual smoking device that had opium residue in it. So now we're getting to about 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. Opium use is prevalent in the major cultures and societies of the region of Europe, Mediterranean, and the Nile Crescent, right? There was other, it wasn't in the Americas yet. And in South America, they were already, rocking the coca, right? They were already doing their stuff with their substances, which we'll talk about in another episode. So now as we get through the current era, about 180 to 200 AD, there is a Roman medical, I don't want to call him a doctor because he didn't go to school for it, but whatever he is, his name is Galen. He's written like 25,000 pages in journals on treatments and causes and effects and outcomes, which is amazing. And one of the people he was the personal physician to, we'll call him, was the famous Roman leader Marcus Aurelius. And Galen wrote in his journals that Marcus Aurelius was taking opium for headaches. But then he found this dude was addicted to it, so he had to keep giving it to him, and he was trying to figure out ways to give him less. So now we go a couple thousand years ago, and we know it's addicting because this is like one of the most prominent medical writers of ancient civilizations, and they would use his philosophies and writings for a long time after that, almost into modern medicine in like the 1700s as it evolves and other ideas flourish. From that point to, about 12, 13, 1400, the Silk Road, which was a trade network established from Shanghai, China, all the way to the Mediterranean. And this was a place where people traded spices. It was a big spice trade route. They were a huge commodity, and the poppy was kind of bunched in with the spices. And then they traded, obviously it's called the Silk Road because all the silk coming out of China. And different towns, villages, and ultimately cities would be established along this route. And it brought the world closer together. So now for the first time in civilization, societies are able to trade and learn about each other and other cultures and other language and customs and products. And for the purposes of this conversation, the spread of the opium poppy would move into the Far East and all the land in between. Now that would flourish for a long time. And then come along in the 1500s, something changes this world forever. And it would change commodity trading forever, and wars and conquering land. And that was the evolution and the development and technology of shipbuilding. It increased exponentially. So people like the Spanish had a base in the Philippines, and they were using all that tropical wood to make these giant ships that were so durable because of how strong that tropical wood was. And they were making their ships like 10 times the size as ships that the world has seen till this time. And that means they could travel further. Just about 1500 or before, we have Columbus, who discovers America. Like that dude never, ever stepped foot in the United States of America. He went off in the islands, and he didn't even know he was there. And when he first went back, he had to like lie about it, because he was like, yeah, I found all this great shit. I know I was supposed to go to the Far East, but here we are. But anyways, that just showed how seafaring vessels and maritime travel really changed. So now we're integrating with cultures in the America and South America and way up in North America and the Far East and the Mediterranean, the Europe, and the world was brought together. And for the opium poppy, this opened up huge new trade markets, and now it flourished. So even though it can move along the Silk Road into parts of China, now that there was sea travel and they could carry so much, it started moving into the port cities so much more. And it would create a huge problem over the next few centuries in China. And also the population growth started to boom because of the sea travel and the settlement, right? And then more wars started to happen, and technology started to evolve. And the use of the poppy was involved in all of these events to treat battle injuries or to trade with natives or other societies that were just being connected to it to the first time. So the 1500s, actually these maps right here, they're both from a Dutch cartographer. This one, I think, is the early 1500s. This is the late 1500s. It shows that they now knew the earth was round and you could travel, and they did a great job capturing all the land in the world on it. I'm sorry, flat earthers. I don't mean to upset anybody, but here it is, the world. You can go around it. Magellan tried, he actually died close to the end. So got to go back to my 8th grade history teacher on that one too. So as we get into like civilized society starting to be established, right? So, you know, we go from like the Huns and the Khans and the medieval warriors and all these things and the kings and the battles to now the British are using these ships to settle all over. The Spanish are settling all over. They're bringing their customs all over. So they're turning these remote parts of the world into towns and cities and creating a civilized society, and, stores and churches and trade and dwellings are building up and cities are being made. And so there's just such a high demand for opium in the New World, the Far East, and always in Europe and in the Nile Valley, in the Near East as well. So we get into the 1800s and something major happens for the opium poppy. Somebody comes along and figures out how to separate the morphine out of it in like 1802. So now you can have a little dose control if you have the technology and you have somebody separating it. But in most parts of the world, it was still just, here's the powder, the ball, whatever, don't overdose and die. And then as we move into the 1800s, the syringe comes into play in the middle of the 1800s. Perfect timing too, right before the Civil War in America, which we have a great episode on. And now they can give morphine injectable. It can hit you harder and it's stronger. Of course, it's way more addicting as well, but it helps with a little dose control, but it doesn't help at all. The chaos of war, not everybody's like, let me measure out this dose. They're just like, take this opium, lick this opium, take this opium gum. Here, take this, drink this opium. Let me shoot you with this opium. So people were overdosing constantly because they didn't know the amount they were to receive. So it spreads through America through the Civil War. And then the British Crown had a huge trade deficit with China because China found a way to capture all the world's silver by selling their porcelain and tea. And the British Crown's like, they won't buy anything from us. And somebody's like, you know what? Let's sell them opium. We know those bitches love their opium. So they started forcing China to buy opium. And it was a disaster. There was 2 wars called the Opium Wars, and China calls it the period of humiliation, where generations of people in China were addicted to opium because of a British trade deficit. And let's not forget, America jumped in on that, and so did other countries. So now in the 1800s, America gets an opiate epidemic from the opium poppy. The opium wars are happening in China, into Eastern Bloc of Europe, into the Crimea, and then at the end of the 1800s, like 1876, this dude comes along and says, "Hey, you know what I can get? I can get heroin out of this morphine." And now they get heroin synthesized out of the morphine. And now they're making everything stronger. And it gets even crazier. And the heroin is supposed to come along and be like, "Oh, it's not as addicting. Don't worry." So now we get into like the 1900s. Opium is a huge commodity around the globe. It's very profitable for people. But governments start really seeing the problem. In America and in England, they're looking at ways to temper all the craziness of the drug use in society. And of course, cocaine pops up in this time period as well. And then something happens. World War I happens. And then there's a demand for drugs and alcohol to the millions and millions and millions of soldiers around the world fighting this battle. And morphine and opium still become a commodity. So it wasn't until after World War I in the 1920s that global regulation on opiates would start to happen. Now, we say opiates, opioids, opium, right? Opium is what comes out of that milky juice. Everything naturally occurring in that milky juice is an opiate. When you synthesize it, separate it, or mix it with other chemicals, it becomes an opioid. And so what happens in the 20th century is researchers and scientists start creating powerful painkillers, right? We get Oxycontin, we get methadone, we eventually get fentanyl, right? And they're not supposed to be addicting, and they're way more addicting. So then we get into the late 1990s, into the early 2000s, and on a global scale, we have an opioid epidemic in this world. In America, it kills about 70 to 80,000 people a year. And it's started by doctors prescribing it. And the dangers of opiates are, once it's in your system, and everybody's different, the way it reacts, the way they feel, but the one thing that's in common is it reprograms your brain, it controls your pathways, and you can't just stop cold turkey. You can, you won't die, but it will feel like you're going to die. So industries pop up around treating how to deal with this. So opium, it's got a 10,000-year history on this earth. It's done some really good things for many people, but it's destroyed civilizations and countries and countless amount of families and lives and communities. That's the history of opium. Email me any questions, historyondrugspodcast@gmail.com.
One,